So let's conclude this section before we move to the annex and then wrap up this particular report from the World Bank. I will take a few points from a couple of IMF reports and also add some case study type information from some other books on adaptation. So it's always important to remember that this particular report and so-called adaptation principles and strategies or strategies for adaptation obviously have a flavor of the authors and the fact that they're in World Bank and have been exposed to certain experiences. So we'll get some other views as well, but very good points made here which are very fundamental and useful. Expenditure reviews and budget tagging as a toolbox. Climate change, public expenditure and institutional reviews, referred to as CPEIRs, use tagging to identify climate change related activities and expenditures, and in some cases quantify the funds allocated in support of climate policies. They typically cover climate change mitigation and adaptation, and inclusion of disaster risk management varies by country. In low and middle income countries, they are often prepared by international organizations in collaboration with central finance agencies to assess policy alignment, effectiveness and efficiency in public spending. There are details here that I won't go into. When you use international organizations, it depends whether it's done as a consultancy by, let's say, McKinsey or some other, MSCI or something, Morgan Stanley and so on. Many of the consulting firms are aligning themselves with providing climate risk maps, adaptation, sustainability guidance and so on. And there are criticisms that these companies actually are very good at writing reports, but often they don't have the expertise and they end up causing more problems than solving problems. So there's always these things to worry about unless there is in-house expertise to do in-house planning of in-house problems, especially in response to climate change risks and climate projections. Okay, keep that in mind. Early examples include World Bank CPIRs for Morocco, so climate change public expenditures and institutional reviews. For Morocco, Philippines, Vietnam and United Nations Development Program CPIRs for Bangladesh, Nepal and Cambodia. There is no standardized tagging methodology for CPEIRs, so you may get different answers based on who gave you the CPEIR in the first place. Most use variations on the OECD's Rio markers and Multilateral Development Bank methodologies. You can look up what those are. The World Bank 2013 CPEIR sourcebook provides an overview of these issues and methodologies for conducting climate change public expenditure and institutional reviews, which I will not go into. Budget tagging is the practice of identifying climate relevant activities and expenditures as part of the routine annual budget process, which is a very important part of the governance. Developing countries have led the way in budget tagging methodologies development, often building on tagging undertaken under CPEIRs. The Philippines, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Nepal and Cambodia were among the first. They have been joined more recently by Kenya, Pakistan, Ghana and Uganda. UNDP's 2019 Knowing What You Spend, a guidance note for governments to track climate finance in their budgets, summarizes experiences from 7 developing countries and provides a step-by-step guide which you can look up. I don't think I will cover it here. In parallel, several OECD countries have developed tagging methodologies. The US Congress has required appropriation bills to identify funds addressing climate change since 2010. Whether US has actually taken any climate action, especially in terms of green technologies and generating employment, is not so clear, but it's a capitalist country and many private ventures exist in solar, wind, sustainability, improving, bringing IoTs to agriculture as part of the adaptation and resilience, climate smart agriculture kind of initiatives. weather-ready nation fits into that, and so on. The European Commission applied EU climate markers based on the Rio markers to track climate finance commitments in its 2014 to 2020 programming period. More recently, Ireland and France have developed budget tagging methodologies. So budget tagging is a very specific aspect of the US resilience activities that I mentioned. But the point was that even though it's part of the budgetary process, action on actual spending to accomplish these is not so clear because of the opposition from multiple quarters, as I said, especially from one of the political parties. It's a two-party system, so you have a very limited option to manipulate the passage of bills and budgets. Defining climate relevance. There are three broad approaches to defining climate relevant activities and expenditures. The positive list approach comprises a standardized set of activities that are eligible for tagging regardless of country context. Green bond standards and MDB methodologies use a positive list for defining mitigation activities, but none of the methodologies use it to identify adaptation activities. Okay, again, sorry to interrupt here, but okay, sorry, these things keep happening when you work from home, but nonetheless, where were we? We were here. So OECD, we talked about these. In terms of defining climate relevance, the positive list approach here, so green bond standards and multilateral development bank methodologies. The objective approach tags activities where the objective is achieving climate outcomes. Okay, activities that reduce vulnerability of human and natural systems to climate impacts by increasing climate resilience are tagged as adaptation related. Given that many development activities can increase resilience, adaptation activities must also identify and state the intent to address specific climate risks, vulnerabilities, and impacts, and demonstrate a direct link. I forgot to turn on the pointer there. This happens a lot. Specific climate risks, vulnerabilities, and impacts, and demonstrate a direct link between these and their proposed activities. So then that makes tagging easier. Instead of adaptation being a co-benefit of something that is not tagged as a budget item for climate adaptation. The Rio markers methodology for mitigation and adaptation applied this approach, which has also been adopted by the Multilateral Development Bank joint methodology and EU taxonomy for identifying adaptation activities. Most of CPIRs and many budgeting tagging methodologies are objective based, and usually some variation on the Rio markers methodology. Okay, coming closer to the end, the policy alignment approach tags activities that are aligned with national climate change policy. Some methodologies only tag activities that are identified in climate change policy documents, for example. In Bangladesh, only programs and thematic priorities identified in the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan are tagged as climate related in the budgets, while in the Philippines, expenditures are tagged to policy initiatives under the National Climate Change Action Plan and Risk Resilience Program. How the budget process and tagging works in terms of sustained funding and the rest of the steps like monitoring progress and so on has to be looked up in other papers. I'm not covering that here. Other methodologies allow agencies to self-assess the policy alignment of climate-related activities and expenditures based on sector climate change policy. The simplest approach assumes that all expenditures related to a tagged activity are climate-related. This is the measurement approach used by green bond standards. Budget tagging methodologies can also be used to assess the proportion of expenditures that are climate relevant. They typically use three or five classification ranging from not relevant to strongly relevant, with corresponding weights expressed as percentages of total program or project cost. There are other details here. Countries have nationally determined contributions, so how the expenditure for achieving those goals are counted may depend on all these words we are using in budget tagging, like not relevant and strongly relevant and everything in between. It's also possible to estimate the proportion of expenditures that are climate related based on the cost of programs or projects' climate related activities. This approach applied in the MDB methodology and in some World Bank CPIRs recognizes that activities with a development purpose can also contribute to achieving climate change objectives. Calculating incremental costs would require comparison with a counterfactual program or project design that does not include climate-related activities. So counterfactual is basically where you are looking at a scenario where all that is planned and done as climate related activity is not done, and see what the outcome was there compared to climate related activities leading to a different outcome. Tagging approaches. Different tagging approaches have different coverage. Expenditure approach of the Rio Marker, MDB and Green Bond methodologies were all designed to tag projects. Okay, so this is expenditures versus budget tagging. This is relatively straightforward. Projects typically have supporting documentation that details objectives, activities, costs and results. Tagging current expenditures is only feasible if the budget has a program classification, ideally with some breakdown of by sub-program project activities and outputs. The tax expenditure approach. Recent assessments by France and Finland identified tax expenditure as an important instrument for financing climate policy and the main instrument for financing expenditure with adverse climate impacts. Where tax expenditures are reported in budget documentation, they can be tagged following the same principles as expenditures executed through the budget process. This is particularly important to identify tax expenditures like many agriculture and energy subsidies that have a negative effect on resilience. So you may be aiding bad practices by providing subsidies in agriculture and energy, for example, dependence on fossil fuels, or subsidizing the fossil fuel itself for energy, and so on. However, most low and middle income countries do not systematically report on tax expenditures. There is the other aspect where people are asked about paying a tax for environmental protection, and they seem to approve the taxes when they are shown that that tax will be kept separate and spent for what was promised and for building resilience, as opposed to throwing it into a pool and using it for something else, right? The off-budget expenditure approach. Explicit subsidies are direct payments that can be identified as expenditures in budget documents and financial statements, and so can be tagged as climate relevant. Tax revenue approach. Taxation is an essential tool for climate change policy. Again, depends on how whether it's a top-down or bottom-up approach, market-based or regulation-based. It can also help address other market failures such as degradation of natural landscapes or inappropriate land use in areas that are subject to disaster risks. Not always market products, market quantifiable benefits. Tagging can support these policies by identifying taxation that has a climate change related objective and supporting the notional earmarking of climate related revenues to climate related expenditures. The subnational government approach. These important actors in adaptation and resilience also account for a substantial share of expenditure in most countries, averaging just over 10% of public expenditure in low-income countries to nearly 40% in high-income countries. Okay, usually assigned critical land use management, urban services, transport and water and environmental management functions. They are often the first line of defense in dealing with disasters. Budget tagging can capture climate-related transfers between central and central and subnational government, where these are earmarked for specific purposes or tied to specific programs. This is the subnational government approach we are talking about. In some countries, subnational governments have taken the initiative in launching climate budget tagging. Odisha state, for instance, prepared India's first climate budget for FY 2020. This happens a lot in the US, with California doing a lot of things and people hoping the California effect will spread good methods to other states and maybe even beyond US. The state-owned enterprise approach, given their role in strategic industries and the energy, water and transport sectors, state-owned enterprises are key players in climate policy, so central finance and planning agencies will need to integrate them into their mitigation and adaptation policies. The purposes of tagging. Anecdotal evidence suggests that tagging successfully serves several purposes, including awareness raising and communication, so people can always say this budget, this fund is tagged for this climate action, and then say this is how you benefited from it. So awareness raising and communication. Tagging raises awareness of climate change risks, vulnerabilities and policies within the government and across external stakeholders by forcing government agencies to consider the link between resource allocation choices and climate priorities. Resource allocation. Tagging informs the allocation of resources in line with climate change policy objectives. This information can influence program and project design if there is a feedback mechanism. Tagging alone is unlikely to influence, much less drive, resource allocation. So tagging is a good practice, but it's not what drives resource allocation or even influence in some cases. Resource mobilization. I don't know, I'm saying it because I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly in the American way. Whenever I'm trying to record podcasts, I switch the accent a little bit because I'm used to teaching in the US for decades, so don't mind it. Resource mobilization. Tagging supports resource mobilization by channeling finance from ethical investors. Early expectations that budget tagging could be used to mobilize climate-related budget support from sources such as the Green Climate Fund have not materialized. Okay, so this is still a process that's evolving. Fiduciary. Green bond standards provide assurance that funds are applied for the purpose intended by requiring definitions of eligible programs and projects, independent verification of eligibility, segregation of funds, independent audit, and impact reporting. Fiduciary concerns could arise in the context of budgeting if there are statutory allocations for climate-related expenditures. Finally, accountability. Tagging can be used to monitor financial commitments in national policy statements and international treaties, like the nationally determined contributions that I mentioned earlier. Broader concepts of accountability for results would require the presentation of information on climate-related impacts alongside financial information. Okay? This brings us to the end of this section. As I said, these are the sections, and now we are left with annexes, which I will cover briefly just because it has additional relevant information, and that will kind of complete the coverage of this book in this series of podcasts. Okay, then we'll move to other books later on. Okay, see you in a minute.